5 months into the war with Iran, Donald Trump is publicly describing the United States as only semi-negotiating, while Iran is still using the Strait of Hormuz as leverage over the global economy. That is the contradiction at the center of this story. Trump launched a war that was supposed to increase American power over Iran. Instead, critics now argue that Washington has fewer good options, less room to maneuver, and a conflict whose economic consequences can reach far beyond the battlefield. And at almost the same moment, another dispute involving American power is unfolding thousands of miles away in Greenland, where a Trump linked oil company has moved equipment toward a drilling project even though Greenlandic authorities say the necessary permissions have not been granted. These look like separate stories, but the same question hangs over both of them. What happens when confidence moves faster than planning, diplomacy, or permission? Start with Iran, because this is where the consequences are already impossible to ignore. Former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, a Republican who once supported Trump, has compared the situation to the political nightmare that consumed Jimmy Carter, an American president being constrained by Iran. His point was not that the circumstances are identical to 1979. They obviously are not. His point was political. Trump built his image around strength, leverage, and the promise that adversaries would bend when confronted. Yet more than 5 months into this conflict, Iran still has something Washington badly wants: a stable, reliably open Strait of Hormuz. That waterway matters because a major share of the world's energy trade passes through it. When access becomes uncertain, the consequences do not stay in the Persian Gulf. Shipping costs rise, insurance becomes more expensive, oil markets react, governments that have nothing to do with the original confrontation suddenly have a reason to pressure Washington and Tehran. So when Iran ties reopening or normalizing traffic through the strait to political demands, it is not merely negotiating over a narrow military issue, it is attaching the dispute to the world economy. And this is where Trump's own language becomes revealing. In a recent interview, he said the United States was low-keying it with Iran and was only semi-negotiating. He also said Washington was watching Iran's inflation and financial problems, suggesting that economic pressure may eventually force Tehran to compromise. That may be a strategy, but it is very different from the image of overwhelming leverage that surrounded the beginning of the war. The administration is now waiting for economic pain to do work that military force has not yet accomplished. The strongest criticism then is not simply that the war has lasted longer than expected. Wars often do. The more serious question is whether the United States entered this one with a realistic plan for the political endgame. Military action can destroy targets, it can degrade capabilities, it can impose costs. But none of those things automatically produces an agreement on the terms you want. If the political objective is unclear, every tactical success can still leave the larger problem sitting there. If you want clear, independent, fact-driven investigations that separate what is documented from what is merely asserted, subscribe. Now look at the negotiations. The source material describes Oman playing a central role in talks with Iran over the Strait of Hormuz. While the United States appears less central than Washington's military power might lead you to expect, that distinction matters. A country can remain the strongest military actor in a region and still lose diplomatic influence over the shape of an agreement. Power is not just the ability to strike, it is the ability to get other governments to choose an outcome you prefer. But now move north, because the Greenland story exposes a different version of the same problem, acting first and assuming the difficult part can be resolved later. Greenland Energy Company, an American oil venture with connections to figures in Trump's political orbit, wants to drill exploratory wells in Jameson Land, a remote part of eastern Greenland. The project is based on older oil exploration rights that survived Greenland's decision in 2021 to stop issuing new oil exploration licenses. That is important. It would be inaccurate to say the company has no underlying connection to a valid license at all. The project traces back to older rights, but those rights do not mean every activity is automatically authorized. That is where the dispute begins. Greenlandic authorities have said that specific approvals are still required before exploration preparations and drilling can proceed, yet equipment connected to the project has already been brought ashore in East Greenland. The government responded with a strong warning and said future logistical activity must be reported to and approved by the Mineral Resources Authority before it happens. This is not a technical footnote. In June, a representative of the company told residents in Itokorturmiit that the project had permission to put equipment on land while drilling permits were pending. Greenland's Resources Ministry publicly contradicted that picture, saying there were no active permissions for exploration activity or preparations for it. Later, the minister responsible for mineral resources said the company's public statements did not always reflect the actual situation. That is a documented contradiction, and it goes directly to trust. If a company tells local residents that it has permission for a physical step in a project, while the government says that permission does not exist, somebody's understanding of the legal situation is wrong. The public should not have to guess which one. The relevant approvals should be published, identified, and matched to the activity they authorize. The company also has politically notable connections. One major shareholder is Republican donor Kenneth Griffin. Company director Carol Craig founded a defense technology business involved with the Golden Dome missile defense program. And television personality Phil McGraw, known as Dr. Phil, has been involved in a documentary project portraying the company's Arctic drilling effort. McGraw supported Trump politically and later appeared with him in the Oval Office in connection with a presidential commission. None of that proves that Trump controls Greenland energy. It does not prove the White House ordered the company to move equipment. It does not prove that the oil project is a covert arm of American foreign policy. Those would be much stronger claims, and the evidence presented here does not establish them. Jameson Land is not an empty industrial zone. The planned wells are associated with an area that includes internationally protected wetlands and habitat used by important bird populations and muskoxen. Environmental concerns were one reason Greenland stopped issuing new oil exploration licenses in 2021. The existence of older licenses means this project may still have a legal path forward, but it does not erase the environmental review or the government's authority to impose conditions. And there is a practical reason permits have to come before momentum. The company has discussed moving roughly 300 shipping containers of drilling equipment across thousands of kilometers of Arctic waters. It has chartered specialized transport and described plans to begin drilling on an aggressive schedule. Once that machinery is mobilized, money starts burning. Every delay becomes expensive. Every permit becomes something investors want resolved quickly. Every government decision takes place under the pressure of sunk costs. There is, however, an important distinction to maintain. Equipment being brought ashore without the approval authorities say was required is not the same thing as unauthorized drilling already taking place. The evidence presented here does not establish that a well has been drilled. It does not establish that Greenland Energy has seized land. It does not establish a military operation. The serious version of this story does not need those exaggerations. What it does establish is enough to justify scrutiny. The company wants to drill. It has invested in preparations. It has publicly discussed an ambitious timetable. A representative made claims about permission that Greenlandic officials disputed. Equipment then arrived, and the government issued a strong warning that future logistical steps required advance approval. That sequence raises an obvious question. Why did a company operating in such a politically sensitive environment allow the legal status of its preparations to become ambiguous in the first place? But uncertainty about motive does not create uncertainty about authority. Greenland's government is the institution that decides whether the required Greenlandic approvals have been granted. A company cannot manufacture regulatory permission through optimism, investor presentations, shipping contracts, or political connections. And this is where the Iran and Greenland stories unexpectedly meet. In Iran, the criticism is that Trump entered the conflict believing force would produce leverage, only to discover that the political endgame was harder than the opening move. In Greenland, an American commercial project appears to have pushed physical preparations forward, while essential permissions remained unresolved. Different actors, different legal questions, different stakes, but a similar strategic failure is visible, treating the first move as if it solves the last problem. It does not. Starting a war is not the same as knowing how to end one. Moving drilling equipment is not the same as having permission to drill. Having an old exploration license is not the same as having every operational approval. Having powerful friends is not the same as having legal authority. And possessing overwhelming military strength is not the same as controlling a negotiation. That difference between capability and control may be the most important thread running through both stories. In the Middle East, Trump can threaten enormous force, and the United States can still find itself waiting on negotiations involving Iran and regional intermediaries. In Greenland, American investors can raise money, charter vessels, hire contractors, produce media, and promote extraordinary estimates of oil wealth, and Greenland's authorities can still say, you do not have permission for the next step. The test is whether that no actually functions as a no, because without a defined end state, it will work out is not a strategy, it is a prediction, and predictions are exactly what both of these situations have too many of. Iran will buckle, economic pressure will work, the oil is there, the permits will come, the project will make Greenland rich, the political complications can be managed, maybe some of those predictions will prove correct, but governments are supposed to plan for what happens when they do not. So return to the opening question. What happens when confidence moves faster than planning, diplomacy, or permission? In Iran, you can end up with a war whose conclusion depends partly on actors you expected to overpower. In Greenland, you can end up with equipment on the ground before the public has a clear answer about what was authorized. In both cases, the cost of the first move creates pressure on every decision that follows. The evidence does not support collapsing these stories into one grand conspiracy. There is no basis here to say Greenland Energy's actions were directed by Trump, and there is no basis to describe a commercial permitting dispute as an American invasion. There is also no basis to pretend the political context is irrelevant. Trump's rhetoric about Greenland, the company's political connections, the disputed statements about permits, and the arrival of equipment make scrutiny not only reasonable but necessary. What is established is more precise. The United States remains locked in a costly confrontation with Iran, while Trump publicly describes a reduced negotiating posture and relies heavily on economic pressure. Iran continues to possess leverage through the Strait of Hormuz. In Greenland, a Trump-linked American oil company is preparing an exploration campaign under older license rights, but Greenlandic authorities say required permissions for key preparatory activity were not in place and have issued a strong warning after equipment was brought ashore. What remains unknown matters just as much. We do not know how the Iran confrontation ends. We do not know whether economic pressure will produce terms Washington can call a success. We do not know whether Greenland Energy will ultimately receive permission to drill. We do not know whether commercially recoverable oil exists beneath Jameson Land. And based on the evidence available here, we do not know that political influence caused any Greenlandic regulatory decision. But we do know who is supposed to decide. Iran will make its own calculations about what pressure it can withstand and what deal it will accept. American leaders are responsible for defining what their war is meant to achieve and how to get out of it. And in Greenland, Greenlandic institutions are responsible for deciding whether an oil project can proceed on Greenlandic territory. That final point should not be controversial. If the permits are granted, the company can operate within their conditions. If they are not granted, money already spent and equipment already moved cannot become substitutes for consent. Otherwise, the permit process becomes theater, and sovereignty becomes something that exists on paper but weakens whenever a powerful outsider creates enough momentum. That is why this story reaches beyond one oil company and one war. It is about whether power is being confused with control, whether action is being confused with strategy, and whether confidence is being allowed to outrun the institutions that are supposed to impose consequences. Iran is showing the limits of military leverage. Greenland is testing the limits of commercial and political pressure. And in both places, the hardest part was never making the first move. It was knowing what authority, legitimacy, and leverage would still be there afterward. For more clear independent investigations that follow the evidence instead of the political script, subscribe.